The morning broke over the auction yard with a thin, bitter light that did little to warm the air. Dust hung heavy despite the chill, stirred by the restless shuffling of hooves in cramped pens. Horses pressed against one another, eyes wide and rolling, the air filled with the sour scent of sweat and fear. Voices barked numbers, quick and sharp, while men with hard faces leaned against the rails, bidding as if they were weighing sacks of grain instead of living creatures. Clara Monroe stood a little apart, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her worn coat, watching. She had come here for no reason she could clearly name, though she told herself it was to find a workhorse. In truth, she had avoided these places for years. They always felt like graveyards disguised as markets. Yet something kept her rooted, her gaze slipping from one animal to another until it found her. In a pen at the far end, half hidden behind taller, stronger horses, stood a mare whose flanks showed the sharp lines of ribs. Her coat was dulled by neglect, her mane tangled and torn, but her eyes, dark and fierce, held a spark that cut straight through Clara's guarded heart. She shifted her weight, and only then did Clara notice the swell of her belly. Pregnant, the mare snorted when a man raised his hand too quickly near the rails, stomping the ground as if daring him to come closer. A low whistle from the buyers confirmed Clara's fear. "That one's heavy and full," one muttered. "Not worth the trouble, except for weight." Another chuckled, naming the slaughterhouse like it was an ordinary destination. The words landed in Clara like stones. Her chest tightened. She remembered long nights on her father's ranch, listening to him speak of horses as if they were sacred. He had taught her to read the tilt of an ear, the flick of a tail, to see the language hidden beneath silence. That memory rose now, unbidden, as she met the mare's stare. There was no plea in those eyes, only defiance. But Clara felt as if she had been asked a question all the same. The bidding began. Voices rose, numbers exchanged like blows. Clara felt her pulse climb, her mouth dry. She had not come prepared to spend what little savings she had managed to keep. Yet her hand lifted almost without thought. A few heads turned in surprise. Hers was not a face often seen in these contests. The bidding jumped higher, one man smirking as if testing her resolve. Clara's stomach knotted. She thought of the lean months ahead, the cost of hay, the repairs still needed on her roof. Then she looked again at the mare's belly, the faint kick stirring life beneath her skin, and all those doubts turned to ash. "Sold!" The word cracked through the air, final and sharp. Clara exhaled, realizing only then that her hands were trembling. The pen gate creaked open. For a long moment, the mare did not move. Then, with a toss of her head and a wary step, she allowed herself to be led out. Clara reached for the rope, her touch careful, slow. The horse tensed but did not bolt, as if recognizing something different in her grasp. The yard had gone quieter. Men whispered, some with pity, some with disdain. Clara ignored them. She walked steadily toward the wagon she had borrowed, each step a weight and a promise. At the ramp she paused, pressing her forehead lightly to the mare's tangled mane. The smell of earth and sweat filled her lungs, grounding her. "You're safe now," she whispered. The words trembled, as if meant as much for herself as for the animal. The mare shifted, blowing warm breath across her sleeve. It was not trust, not yet, but it was not rejection either. That was enough. As Clara secured the gate behind them, a thought settled over her with the heaviness of a vow. She had not simply bought a horse. She had chosen a burden that would change everything. And deep inside, beneath the chill of the morning, she felt the faintest flicker of warmth, like the start of a fire that would not be easily put out. The wind that swept across Clara's ranch carried with it a raw edge, sharp enough to rattle loose boards on the fence and sting her cheeks as she worked. The land stretched wide and bare, a patchwork of brittle grass and hard-packed soil that had seen better years. It was not much, but it was hers, and now it had to become a refuge for the mare she had brought home. Hope. That was the name she had settled on as she watched the horse pace the corral, restless, muscles twitching with suspicion at every sound. Hope refused halters, refused touch. She circled endlessly, ears pinned, eyes flicking from Clara to the empty horizon as though calculating escape. Clara stood patient, arms crossed, letting the cold bite into her as hours stretched. She spoke softly, low words without demand, letting silence do most of the work. Nights found her perched on a wooden stool by the fence, lantern burning weakly, reading aloud from her father's weathered journal. The mare pretended not to listen, but now and then her ears tilted toward the sound. A subtle concession that kept Clara returning each evening. The neighbors had been quick to judge. They stopped her at the general store, voices lowered yet cutting. A burden mare, and heavy and full? She'll eat through your winter hay before long. Another scoffed, shaking his head. You can't save every stray that crosses your path, Clara. Better to cut loose than drown with it. Their words pressed like weights, but Clara bore them in silence. She had been called stubborn before, and if stubbornness was all that kept the mare alive, then she would wear the name proudly. Money grew tighter. Clara mended her own boots with coarse stitching, patched her coat with scraps of burlap, and stretched her meals thin. More than once, she set aside her own portion to make sure the feed buckets were filled. Watching Hope eat steadied her, even when her stomach growled in protest. It was a trade she made willingly, though each night she marked the dwindling supplies with a quiet dread. Then came a moment that shifted everything. Clara leaned against the corral rail one dusk, the last of the sun painting the land in rust and gold. Hope, restless as ever, paced a few lengths away. Clara reached her hand out over the wood, palm open, offering nothing but stillness. Minutes passed. The mare hesitated, hooves scuffing the dirt, then took a tentative step closer. Another. Her breath came in short, nervous bursts, until her muzzle brushed against Clara's fingers. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver through Clara's chest. For the first time since bringing Hope home, the distance between them had begun to close. That night, Clara dreamt of her father's voice, steady and calm, reminding her of the bond forged in patience rather than force. When she woke, the sound of wind rattling the shutters seemed less menacing. She carried that dream with her as she walked to the barn, where Hope's shadow shifted inside. Yet peace was fragile. Clouds began to gather as the day wore on, dark and heavy, the air thick with the promise of rain. By evening, the storm broke, wind howling through the valley, lightning splitting the sky. Clara rushed to the barn, heart hammering. Inside, Hope was down on her side, hooves kicking, nostrils flaring in panic. The sight froze Clara in place. The mare was in pain, her body twisting with the early tremors of labor. Too soon! Much too soon! Clara dropped to her knees in the straw, her breath ragged as thunder rolled overhead. She pressed a trembling hand to the mare's neck, whispering words that were nearly lost to the storm. The weight of everything pressed in at once. Her choice, her defiance, her promise. And as Hope cried out, Clara understood that whatever lay ahead would demand more of her than she had ever given before. The barn shook with every strike of thunder, the storm raging as if the heavens themselves had chosen to test Clara's resolve. She knelt in the straw beside Hope, the mare's sides heaving, sweat slicking her dull coat until it gleamed in the flickering lantern light. The foal inside pressed forward too soon, and every groan from the mare cut into Clara like a blade. She whispered steadily, her voice breaking against the roar of the storm. Words meant less to command than to anchor. Easy now, girl. I'm here. We'll get through this. We'll get through. The hours blurred. Clara worked with frantic care, guiding, coaxing, pulling when she had to, her hands shaking but unyielding. The storm outside seemed to match the battle within the mare's body, relentless, merciless. At last, with one final surge, the foal slipped into Clara's waiting arms, wet and trembling, a fragile bundle of life. For a breath, the barn fell silent except for the harsh panting of mother and the ragged gasps of the woman who had fought alongside her. Then the foal stirred, legs flailing weakly, head bobbing as though testing the very idea of existence. Clara laughed through her tears, her chest breaking open with relief. "You're alive," she whispered, cradling the tiny creature close before laying it gently at Hope's side. The mare lifted her head, eyes softening as she nuzzled her newborn. Clara pressed her forehead to the mare's damp shoulder, feeling the tremor of breath beneath her skin. Both of you saved. Dawn came pale and washed clean after the storm, spilling through the barn's broken slats to paint the scene in silver. Clara, exhausted, leaned against a post, watching as the foal, still wobbling, found its legs. Hope stood guard, her gaze sharp but no longer distrustful. The air carried the faintest trace of something Clara had not felt in years. Hope made flesh. As she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, her hand brushed against a raised edge beneath Hope's matted fur. Curious, Clara parted the tangled hair and froze. Branded into the mare's flank was a mark, faint but unmistakable. She traced it with careful fingers, heart thudding. It was a symbol she had not seen since her father's passing, the same mark he had once shown her in old journals. Proof of the wild herd he had dedicated his life to protecting. The truth hit her with a force stronger than the storm. This mare had not simply been another nameless creature dragged to auction. She had once belonged to that free herd, one her father had defended at cost to himself. Hope was not chance. She was a fragment of his legacy, nearly lost to cruelty. Clara's throat tightened as she realized what her rescue had truly meant. She had unknowingly carried her father's work forward, answering a call he had once believed might never be heard again. Word traveled quickly through the small town. Neighbors came by, at first out of curiosity, then out of something deeper. They stood by the corral, watching the foal stumble beside its mother, and many could not hide the sheen in their eyes. One boy brought apples, placing them carefully by the fence. A woman left a bundle of carrots. Where once there had been scorn, there was now a quiet reverence, born not from Clara's defiance, but from what the mare and foal represented. Clara remained near the barn, her hand resting against the foal's warm neck, feeling the fragile beat of a heart that should never have survived. The sun climbed higher, gilding the scene with light. For the first time in years, Clara felt her grief and her father's absence ease beneath the weight of something greater. She whispered to the foal, her voice catching but steady, "You were meant to be here, and so was I." The moment carried her, yet she knew the story was not done. The world had begun to notice, and with that came both promise and peril. What she had saved was more than a mare and her foal. It was a truth that demanded to be defended. The prairie glowed beneath the late sun, the storm-washed sky stretching wide and unbroken. Clara stood before a gathering of townsfolk, her boots planted firm in the dirt, the foal and its mother grazing just beyond the corral. Faces that once turned away from her now watched with quiet expectation. She swallowed against the lump in her throat, fingers tightening around the folded letter she had carried for years. When she spoke, her voice wavered at first, then grew steady, anchored by the sight of Hope and the foals standing side by side. "We measure worth in weight in coin, in what's easy to see," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "But some things can't be weighed. This mare was bound for slaughter. Her foal—" She paused as the young one lifted its head, legs still clumsy but strong. "Would never have seen the light of day. And yet, here they are, alive because I chose not to look away." A murmur moved through the crowd. A few men shifted uncomfortably, their pride pricked by the truth in her words. Others nodded, tears glinting in their eyes. Clara unfolded the letter, its edges worn soft, the ink faded but still legible. She read aloud, her father's words carrying into the wind. Every Mustang saved carries the memory of freedom. Protect them, and you protect something far greater than yourself. Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. I thought I'd failed him. Failed myself. But this mare, this foal, they reminded me that his fight is still here. And now it's mine. Silence settled, heavy and reverent. Then, one by one, the townsfolk stepped forward. A farmer laid down a sack of oats. A young girl placed a ribbon on the fence post, whispering a blessing. Even the hardest of skeptics removed his hat, his eyes lowered. What had begun as ridicule had shifted into something Clara had never expected. Respect, and perhaps even shared responsibility. Later, when the crowd dispersed and the prairie quieted again, Clara lingered by the corral. The foal bolted forward in a burst of energy, legs tangling before it found its rhythm. Hope followed close, her stride protective but unburdened, her eyes no longer wild with fear. Clara leaned on the weathered rail, exhaustion pulling at her, but softened by a peace she had not known in years. She drew the letter from her pocket once more, pressing it to her chest before tucking it safely away. Her father's voice seemed to echo on the wind, not in sorrow but in pride. She understood now that saving Hope had never been only about defying the slaughterhouse. It had been about stepping into the space her father had left behind. About carrying forward a promise written not just in ink, but in blood and sacrifice. The horizon burned gold as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the land. Clara's tears blurred the light, but she did not wipe them away. They were not of grief this time, but of release. She whispered into the dusk, the words fragile yet certain. You saved me as much as I saved you. The foal stumbled again, then straightened, finding balance beneath the weight of its fragile frame. Hope nickered softly, nudging it forward, and together they moved into the expanse of pasture as though the world ahead belonged to them. Clara watched, her heart breaking open in the gentlest way, knowing this was only the beginning.